Okay, so are you ready to dive in and see if maybe this person has uh, what it takes to be president?
I think so. Let's see what we can uncover.
All right, so we're taking a deep dive into this speech.
Hmm.
And like I mentioned, we're going to try to glean some insight into their leadership potential from what they said and how they said it.
Right, because a speech can be really revealing.
Exactly. So, like, right off the bat, this speech is pretty dramatic. It starts with this uh, really detailed retelling of the assassination attempt on the speaker.
Yeah, it definitely grabs your attention.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They even describe, like, the sound of the bullet and seeing the blood and everything.
It's a powerful way to start a speech, and you can see how it really connects with the audience.
Yeah. And speaking of the audience,
Yeah,
their reaction to that story is interesting, too. They don't, like, freak out or anything. They just kind of stand their ground.
right. It's like they're ready to fight back alongside the speaker.
Exactly. And that kind of sets the tone for the rest of the speech.
Hmm.
It's all about strength and resilience and overcoming adversity.
Yeah, there's definitely a fighter theme running through it.
Right. Totally. And that leads us to the next thing that really stood out to me, which is how the speaker talks about their political opponents.
Yeah, it gets pretty heated.
It's not exactly subtle. They call them incompetent and basically accuse them of trying to destroy the country.
There are some pretty strong accusations thrown around.
And some pretty colorful insults, too, like comparing someone to Hannibal Lecter.
I mean, it definitely got a reaction from the crowd.
Oh, yeah, they loved it. But it makes you wonder if that's really how a president should be talking about their rivals.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, it does raise questions about their leadership style. Are they someone who seeks compromise and common ground, or are they more confrontational?
Good question. So on the one hand, you've got this really aggressive rhetoric, but then the speaker pivots to these big policy promises, like ending inflation, closing the border, bringing back manufacturing jobs.
Yeah, they cover a lot of ground.
It's like they're trying to appeal to everyone.
Right, but it's interesting because they don't always go into a lot of detail about how they're going to accomplish all these things.
Yeah, it's a lot of big promises, but not a lot of specifics.
For example, they say they'll end inflation immediately, but they don't really explain what policies they'd use to do that.
Exactly. It makes you wonder how realistic some of these promises actually are.
That's a good point. Because governing is a lot more complicated than just making promises.
For sure. So we've got this interesting mix of, like, strong rhetoric, big promises, and not a lot of details on how it's all going to work.
It definitely makes you think about what kind of leader this person would be.
It really does. So what do you think? Should we keep digging and see if we can find some more clues?
Absolutely. I'm curious to see what else we can uncover about this speaker.
Right, let's do it.
So it's interesting how that speech kind of jumps back and forth between those big promises and a less detailed approach to how they'd actually, make those things happen.
Yeah, there's a lot of what, but not a lot of how.
Right. And luckily, our next source dives into exactly that. It's an analysis of the speaker's main economic proposals, things like ending inflation, bringing back manufacturing jobs, that sort of thing.
Okay, so this source is trying to figure out if those promises actually hold up under scrutiny.
Exactly. And they point out that a lot of those promises are rooted in a very specific economic philosophy, one that really emphasizes deregulation, tax cuts, and boosting domestic production.
Hmm, that definitely sounds familiar.
It
It's like that whole America First idea.
Yeah, exactly. And the analysts in this source basically say that while that approach sounds good on paper, it might not be enough to deal with how complicated the global economy really is.
Right, like things like inflation and trade deals.
Yeah.
Those aren't just things you can control within one country.
Exactly. And they also raise concerns about what some of those proposals could mean in the long run, especially when it comes to environmental regulations and trade agreements.
So basically, are we maybe trading short-term gains for long-term problems?
That's a really important question to ask, especially when we're trying to figure out if someone would be a good president.
Right, because being president isn't just about making big promises. It's about understanding all the complexities and finding solutions that actually work.
Exactly. So we've got this source raising some serious questions about the speaker's economic ideas. But what about foreign policy? The speaker was pretty vocal about immigration and national security.
Oh yeah, they definitely took a hard line on those issues.
And that's where our next source comes in. It offers a different perspective on that whole America First approach when it comes to foreign policy.
Okay, so is this source saying that America First is a bad idea?
Not necessarily. It's more like they're pointing out the potential downsides of that approach.
Okay, I'm listening.
So, for example, the speaker really pushed that Remain in Mexico policy and talked about how it was tough but effective at controlling immigration. They even mentioned securing agreements to keep illegal aliens on foreign soil. Does that sound familiar?
Yeah, I remember that part of the speech.
Well, this source argues that policies like that can have some pretty big costs. Like it could damage relationships with other countries and hurt America's reputation on the world stage.
Hmm. Yeah, it's like you're trying to solve one problem, but you might be creating new ones in the process.
Exactly. And this source also brings up concerns about human rights and how those policies could affect stability in the region.
So it's a reminder that foreign policy is about way more than just being tough. It's about navigating those relationships with other countries and finding common ground.
Right. It's about balancing what's good for America with what's good for the world as a whole.
Okay, so now we've got one source questioning the economic side of things and another source raising concerns about the foreign policy side.
It seems like there might be a bit of a disconnect between the speaker's rhetoric and the realities of governing.
Yeah, it's making me wonder if maybe they're oversimplifying some pretty complex issues.
It's definitely something to think about. So, to get back to our original question, would this person make a good president? Well, it's still tough to say for sure.
Right, because there are definitely some positive qualities there. Like, they seem really decisive and they have a clear vision.
Yeah, those can be good things in a leader, especially during tough times.
But then you've got that other side of it, the tendency to oversimplify things and maybe not fully grasp the consequences of their actions.
And that's where things get tricky. Because those same qualities that could make someone a strong leader could also lead to some pretty big mistakes.
So how do we weigh those things against each other?
Well, that's a great question. And I think our next source can help us out. It's a really interesting analysis of different presidential leadership styles throughout American history.
Okay, so we're getting some historical context now.
Exactly. This source looks at how things like personality circumstances and leadership approach has shaped both the successes and failures of past presidents.
This is getting really interesting. So where does our speaker fit into all of this?
Well, that's the fascinating part. They seem to embody elements of several different leadership styles, which makes it hard to put them in just one box.
So they're kind of a mixed bag, which I guess is probably true of most leaders.
Yeah, for sure. But let's break it down a bit. So there are definitely some signs of the transformational leader, someone who inspires people with a bold vision for the future and motivates them to embrace change.
Oh yeah, I could definitely see that. Remember how their speech started? That whole story of survival and fighting back and the big promises for a better future?
Exactly. That's classic transformational leadership.
Okay, what else?
Well, there are also elements of the populist leader, someone who connects directly with the people and often taps into their frustrations and anxieties. They position themselves as the champion of the everyday person against the elites or the establishment.
Right, like that whole us versus them mentality and how they always talk about representing the forgotten men and women.
Exactly. And this is where it gets a little more complicated. There's also a hint of the authoritarian leader.
Wait, really?
Yeah, someone who prefers strong, centralized control values, loyalty above everything else, and might be willing to bend or break the rules to get what they want.
Wow. Okay, that's a little concerning. Where are you seeing that in the speaker's behavior?
Well, there are a few times where the speaker seems to admire these strongman leaders, and they kind of brush off any criticism like it's not even legitimate. And they keep saying that they're the only ones with the right answers. Remember when they talked about Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, and how they said other countries are afraid of him? I don't know. It just seemed a little off to me. What do you think?
Yeah, now that you mention it, that does seem to fit with that authoritarian style. And then there are all those attacks on the media and the judges and anyone who disagrees with them. It's like they're saying they're the only ones who know the truth and everyone else is wrong, which I guess can be a powerful message, but it's also kind of scary.
It's definitely a classic authoritarian tactic. So we've got this mix of like transformational leadership populism and even some authoritarian tendencies all rolled into one person. It really makes you wonder what kind of president they would actually be. Would they bring people together or would they just make things even more divided?
It's hard to say based on just this one speech. There are definitely some signs of strong leadership there. But there's also that potential for things to go in a really bad direction if they let those authoritarian impulses take over.
Yeah, it's like a fork in the road. It all depends on whether they would kind of soften their approach once they're actually in office, or if they would just double down on those more divisive parts of their personality.
Which brings us to our last source for this deep dive. And this one I think is really important. It's basically a bunch of fact-checking articles that looked at different claims the speaker made throughout the speech.
Oh, that's interesting. So they're checking to see if the speaker was actually telling the truth.
Exactly. Some of the claims were about policies, some were from personal stories the speaker told, and some were even about historical events.
Hmm.
There were definitely a few that made me raise an eyebrow. Or remember when they said that 107% of the new jobs created during their last time in office went to illegal immigrants? I mean, come on, that just didn't sound right. And then there was that other claim about how crime is going down everywhere in the world except in the United States. Did the fact checkers find any truth to those statements?
Well, it's kind of a mixed bag. Some of the claims were partly true, but taken out of context. Some were just totally false. And some were kind of in between, like that 107% statistic. The fact checkers pointed out that that's literally impossible mathematically. It's like they were just trying to twist the numbers to fit their narrative.
Which is pretty worrying. I mean, if someone's willing to bend the truth like that when they're trying to get elected, what does that say about how they'll act once they're actually in power? Will they be honest with the people?
Hmm.
Or will they just keep manipulating things to get what they want?
That's a really important point because trust is so crucial for any leader, especially in a democracy. And when a leader constantly says things that aren't true, it just erodes that trust and makes it hard for people to believe anything they say.
Yeah, it's like the whole foundation of their leadership starts to crumble.
Uh,
So it seems like effective leadership isn't just about being charismatic and giving good speeches. It's also about being honest and having integrity.
Absolutely. So after listening to the speech and digging into all these sources, do you think we can answer the question, would this person make a good president?
Hmm. It's tough to say. I think we've seen both the good and the bad. There's definitely potential there. They're charismatic, they connect with people, they're not afraid to shake things up. But then there's that other side, the tendency to oversimplify things, the lack of specifics, the questionable relationship with the truth.
And those authoritarian tendencies we talked about.
Right, it's like a really complex picture with a lot of different pieces.
Yeah.
And ultimately, it's up to each individual to decide how much weight they give to each of those pieces.
Exactly. There's no easy answer to this question. And that's kind of the point of this whole deep dive, you know? We're not here to tell you what to think. We just want to give you the information and the different perspectives so you can make up your own mind.
So that's it for our deep dive into this speech. We hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little challenging.
Remember, speeches can be really persuasive, but they're only one part of the story. To really understand a leader, you got to look at their actions, their history, their values.
So what do you think about this person? Do you see them as a potential leader who could do great things? Or are you more worried about the potential risks? We'd love to hear your thoughts.
And keep in mind, this is just one piece of the puzzle. To get the full picture, you got to keep researching, keep asking questions, keep digging deeper.
Exactly. So thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring and keep thinking critically.
Thanks, everyone.